Picture this. I'm shaking hands with Michigan's State Attorney General discussing how my HOA president has been systematically defrauding elderly homeowners for 2 years when suddenly my cabin door explodes open. No knock, no warrant, no permission, and in storms the devil herself. Brenda Wickshire, clipboard clutched like a weapon, starts shrieking about immediate compliance violations before she even looks up. This woman has spent 6 months trying to steal my grandfather's property with fraudulent fines and fake liens, and now she's just committed felony breaking and entering. But here's the beautiful part. She freezes mid-scream when she sees the state's top prosecutor standing in my living room. The Attorney General doesn't even blink. "Ma'am, you just committed multiple felonies in front of Michigan's chief law enforcement officer. Please step outside while we discuss your criminal charges." Brenda's face goes dead white. Justice was about to be served ice cold. What would you do if your HOA tyrant walked into the biggest mistake of her life? Where are you watching from? And have you survived an HOA nightmare? Let me tell you how this nightmare started. My name's Rex Holloway, and 3 years ago I inherited something irreplaceable. My grandfather's lake cabin on 2.3 acres in Lakeshore Pines, Michigan. Built in 1960 with his own calloused hands after he came back from Korea, this place has hand-hewn cedar beams, a fieldstone fireplace that could heat half the county, and a private dock where 3 generations of Holloways learned to fish. Every morning, mist rises off the lake like the ghosts of 1,000 perfect sunrises, and I make coffee in Grandpa's dented aluminum percolator, that distinctive bubbling sound mixing with loons calling across the water. The old floorboards creak stories of 60 years of family barbecues and Christmas mornings. When I run my hand along the original cedar siding, the rough-hewn texture still holds the smell of sawdust and my grandfather's Old Spice aftershave. I moved here after my divorce, broken and seeking peace. Instead, I got Brenda Wickshire, the human equivalent of a paper cut that gets infected. Picture a 58-year-old failed insurance adjuster who discovered that terrorizing neighbors was more profitable than her day job. Pressed khakis ironed to razor sharpness, sensible orthopedic shoes, and a measuring tape clipped to her belt like she's some kind of compliance commando. She drives a spotless white Toyota Highlander with HOA official emblazoned on the bumper, and I swear this woman practices intimidating expressions in her rearview mirror. Brenda slithered into our peaceful development 5 years ago and seized the HOA presidency within 18 months, running on a platform of property value protection. Her reign of terror reads like a Geneva Convention violation list. She forced 84-year-old Mrs. Patterson to remove bird feeders because they encouraged vermin, sued Vietnam veteran Tom Bradley over his American flag being 3 inches too tall, and literally made a cancer survivor remove her memorial wind chimes because they created noise pollution. But I had something that made her eyes light up with greed, prime lakefront property that predated her little dictatorship by 20 years. She materialized at my door on a gray Tuesday morning like a bad rash, clutching what she called a courtesy notice. Courtesy? This woman had manufactured 47 violations on my grandfather's cabin. My dock extended 3 feet beyond allowable waterfront parameters. The shed was improperly positioned relative to mandatory setbacks. Even my fire pit qualified as an unpermitted recreational combustion structure. $500 in compliance review fees plus $75 daily until I corrected these imaginary problems. When I pointed out that my cabin existed decades before her HOA fantasy, she delivered a smile that could curdle fresh milk. Previous ownership is legally irrelevant, Mr. Holloway. All properties within HOA jurisdiction must comply with current regulations, regardless of antiquated construction dates. 30 days, or we file a lien. A lien. Against land my grandfather built board by board, nail by nail, with savings from his factory job and dreams of leaving something permanent for his family. That night I drove to the county courthouse, fury burning in my chest like acid. Digging through dusty HOA formation documents, I discovered something that made my hands shake with rage. The HOA incorporated exactly 3 months after Grandpa's funeral. Convenient timing for vultures. But the smoking gun? The original developer's son, now a current board member, had forged my dead grandfather's signature on the consent forms. Not sloppy paperwork, not a clerical error, calculated fraud designed to steal from a dead veteran. But knowing and proving are different beasts entirely. I needed evidence, strategy, and patience. Most importantly, I needed to be 10 times smarter than Brenda Wickshire had ever been in her pathetic, power-hungry existence. This wasn't just about property taxes or HOA fees anymore. This was about honor, legacy, and making sure that my grandfather's sacrifice meant something. Brenda had picked the wrong veteran's family to rob. War was declared. I just didn't know yet that she'd been systematically looting the entire neighborhood, or that her crimes would eventually land her in federal handcuffs. Brenda returned exactly 1 week later like a bad rash, but this time she brought backup. At 6:30 a.m., because apparently terrorizing neighbors requires early morning ambushes, I jolted awake to the sound of metal clanging and voices sharp enough to wake the dead. Through my bedroom window, morning mist still clinging to the lake, I watched her direct a surveyor setting up equipment while Dale Pritchard lurked nearby like a guilty accomplice. Pritchard owned the tire shop in town and had about as much backbone as a wet noodle, but Brenda had him trained to follow orders. The metallic whine of surveying equipment mixed with Brenda's drill sergeant voice as she barked measurements to Pritchard, who scribbled notes like he was documenting evidence at a murder scene. Autumn leaves crunched under their boots as they trampled around my property for 3 solid hours, measuring everything from my cabin to my grandfather's sacred fire pit. "We're conducting a comprehensive compliance assessment," Brenda announced when I appeared on my porch, coffee mug steaming in the cool air. "HOA regulations grant us inspection access for violation verification." The surveyor, Jimmy Kowalski, looked about as comfortable as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs. He measured every structure, while Brenda snapped over 200 photos with her phone, including shots through my windows when she thought I wasn't watching. But here's what they didn't know. I'd spent the previous evening installing security cameras around my property. Years ago, during my military logistics training, I'd learned that documentation beats confrontation every time. Michigan law allows property owners to record anyone on their land without consent, which meant every step of their little circus was being preserved in high definition. While they measured and photographed, I did some research of my own. Pritchard's tire shop owed $18,000 in back property taxes, information that's public record if you know where to look. Even better, a quick search revealed that Brenda's insurance license had been suspended 2 years earlier for filing fraudulent damage claims. This woman was lecturing me about legal compliance while she couldn't even maintain her own professional credentials. The real game changer came after they packed up their equipment. Jimmy approached me privately, glancing around like he expected Brenda to pop out of the bushes. "Mr. Holloway, I need to tell you something," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "She only paid me half my fee and still owes me $800, but that's not the worst part." Jimmy explained that Brenda had explicitly instructed him to find violations, regardless of whether the measurements actually showed problems. She wanted ammunition for her lawsuit, not accurate surveying. When he'd hesitated, she'd threatened to report him to the county for improper practices, the exact thing she was asking him to do. "If you help me get my money back," Jimmy offered, "I'll testify about what she really wanted me to find." 3 days later, my security cameras captured comedy gold. Jimmy had returned to retrieve a forgotten piece of equipment, and the footage clearly showed him relieving himself behind my tool shed. Not exactly criminal behavior, but when I mentioned it to Brenda, her reaction was priceless. "That's absolutely disgusting," she shrieked over the phone. "I'm reporting this as a health code violation." "Feel free," I replied, barely containing my laughter. "But you might want to explain to the health department why you hired someone with such questionable professional habits." The absurdity would have been hilarious if Brenda hadn't already filed a lawsuit demanding $12,000 in accumulated violations plus attorney fees. She was also pushing for an emergency injunction to prevent me from using my own dock during the litigation period. My family's dock. The one my grandfather built with his own hands. Her biggest tactical error was running her mouth at Murphy's Diner downtown. Sal Torino called me personally to report that Brenda had spent an entire lunch hour telling anyone within earshot that I was a mentally unstable veteran who threatens his neighbors. Those weren't just lies. They were legally actionable defamatory statements that could damage my reputation and relationships. More importantly, they established a clear pattern of malicious harassment that would play beautifully in any courtroom. I started documenting everything, every interaction, every statement, every photograph she took. Brenda thought she was building a case against me, but she was actually constructing her own legal coffin, one violation at a time. The measuring tape wars had taught me something crucial. Brenda was playing checkers while I was setting up for chess. She wanted attrition, thinking I'd eventually crack under financial pressure and legal harassment. She had no idea that every escalation was creating evidence for the federal case slowly taking shape in my mind. Jimmy Kowalski was just the first domino. Soon, I'd have an entire parade of witnesses ready to testify about her systematic abuse of power. 2 weeks later, a process server knocked on my door at 7 a.m. sharp, interrupting the peaceful bubbling of my grandfather's coffee percolator. Nothing says good morning like being handed a lawsuit thick enough to use as kindling. Brenda's legal masterpiece read like bad fiction. 847 separate HOA violations dating back 3 years. Apparently, I'd been a criminal mastermind without knowing it. She wanted $12,000 immediately, plus attorney fees that would probably buy her a new Toyota. The cherry on top, an emergency injunction to prevent me from using my own dock during the litigation period, my family dock. The one where my grandfather taught me to tie fishing knots, and my daughter caught her first bass. But Brenda's real genius was her whisper campaign. At Murphy's Diner, she'd lean across tables like she was sharing state secrets. That Rex Holloway is a dangerous, unstable veteran who threatens innocent neighbors. The scent of bacon and gossip mixed in the morning air as she poisoned every conversation. Sally McKenzie from the flower shop literally crossed Main Street when she saw me coming, clutching her purse like I might assault her with my coffee mug. I hired Stella Crawford, a property attorney from Grand Rapids with silver hair, steel eyes, and the kind of smile that meant someone was about to get legally dismantled. Over coffee at her office, she dropped some knowledge that changed everything. "Rex, something interesting about Michigan law," Stella said, shuffling through Brenda's paperwork. "We have private attorney general statutes. When citizens uncover systematic fraud affecting the public, they can actually sue on behalf of everyone harmed." She explained that HOA formation isn't just paperwork, it requires genuine consent from existing property owners. My cabin clearly predated their little kingdom, and properties with established rights can't be retroactively subjected to new restrictions. It's like trying to charge someone rent for land they already own. We filed a devastating countersuit, fraudulent HOA formation, elder abuse for forging my grandfather's signature, and systematic harassment. Stella requested an emergency hearing to kill Brenda's injunction, arguing she had no legal authority over my pre-existing property rights. The breakthrough came at the next HOA board meeting. I walked into the community center conference room, stale coffee smell mixing with nervous perspiration from 5 board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, and took a seat in the back, phone recording legally in my pocket. Brenda was mid-rant about the Rex situation when Dale Pritchard, apparently forgetting basic intelligence, blurted out, "Look, we all know the HOA formation was rushed through before anyone could object. My cousin at the county office said the paperwork was sketchy from day one. Maybe we should just—" "Dale!" Brenda's voice cracked like a whip, but the damage was done. Every person in that room had just heard a board member admit they knew their formation was legally questionable. The silence that followed was so thick you could cut it with Brenda's measuring tape. Her nephew, serving as board attorney despite having about as much property law experience as my fishing tackle box, immediately called recess and spent 10 minutes whispering frantically with his aunt. His face was pale as old milk, and sweat stains were blooming under his cheap suit jacket. After the meeting, 3 neighbors approached me in the parking lot under the yellow streetlights, voices hushed like we were planning a revolution. Martha Kessler, the elderly widow whose memorial garden Brenda had destroyed. She made me dig up my husband's roses. 40 years of marriage, and she called them unauthorized landscaping. Tom Bradley, the veteran. "Rex, I survived 2 tours in Afghanistan, but I've never been as afraid of anyone as I am of that woman." Young couple with twin toddlers. She fined us $300 because our kids' chalk drawings were defacing common walkways. Each story revealed the same pattern. Brenda systematically targeted vulnerable residents who couldn't afford legal fights. Elderly widows, veterans on fixed incomes, young families, stretched thin. She was a predator disguised as a bureaucrat. Stella's research revealed that my grandfather's original deed included specific riparian rights, permanent water access that no later HOA could touch, no matter what rules they invented. Those rights were literally carved in legal stone, protected by decades of property law precedent. But instead of backing down when faced with legal reality, Brenda escalated. Her brother-in-law at First National Bank started making inquiries about my mortgage, fishing for pressure points. She began daily compliance inspections, showing up at dawn and dusk with her clipboard, photographing my garbage cans and measuring my grass like she was conducting forensic analysis. The harassment was becoming personal, vindictive, almost obsessive. But every escalation was creating more evidence of systematic abuse of power. My security cameras captured everything, and my phone recorded every conversation. Brenda thought she was tightening the noose. She was actually weaving her own legal straitjacket. 3 weeks after our legal gambit, Brenda dropped the nuclear option. A certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, the smell of fresh lake air turning sour as I read the contents. She'd filed a lien against my property for $18,500, including accumulated legal fees and something called community impact damages. But that wasn't her masterstroke. Her brother-in-law at First National Bank started calling my mortgage company, suggesting my property was under legal cloud and might require risk assessment review. Nothing like family connections to turn banking into extortion. The daily harassment reached psychotic levels. Brenda started showing up at random hours, 6 a.m., lunchtime, even 9 p.m., with her trusty clipboard, snapping photos of everything from my garbage cans to visiting delivery trucks. She'd crouch behind bushes, measuring the distance between my dock posts, then pop up like a demented jack-in-the-box to announce new violations. One morning, the crunch of gravel under her orthopedic shoes woke me before dawn. Through my bedroom window, I watched her photograph my guest's pickup truck, then measure the distance from bumper to property line with a tape measure that probably cost more than most people's monthly groceries. Unauthorized overnight parking in violation of subsection 12.4, she announced to nobody in particular, talking to her phone's voice recorder like she was documenting evidence at a crime scene. The woman was losing her grip on reality, but her financial pressure campaign was brutally effective. My daughter called from college, worried because her mother had received concerning information about my legal troubles. My ex-wife, bless her suspicious heart, wanted to know if our daughter's college fund was at risk. "Dad, are you really going to lose Grandpa's cabin?" my daughter asked, her voice small and scared over the phone. That question hit harder than any lawsuit. This wasn't just about property rights anymore. It was about preserving something for the next generation. But while Brenda was playing harassment games, I was playing detective. My attorney Stella had taught me to follow the money, and Brenda's money trail led straight into fraud territory. The HOA's books showed $67,000 missing from the reserve fund over 2 years. Digging deeper through public records, I discovered payments flowing from the HOA account to something called Wickshire Property Management LLC, Brenda's personal company that had never managed any properties except extracting money from her neighbors. The missing funds had bankrolled her son's failed restaurant venture and, according to credit reports I could legally access, covered some serious gambling debts she'd racked up at the casino 90 miles north. Then my security cameras caught something beautiful. At 11 p.m. on a Thursday, footage showed Brenda sneaking around my property with a bag from Murphy's Diner. She crept toward my septic system area, dumped something near the drain field, then scurried back to her Highlander like a guilty raccoon. The next morning, she arrived at 8 a.m. sharp with an anonymous complaint about environmental violations and potential groundwater contamination. The irony was delicious. She was reporting her own sabotage. But the video evidence was even better. My cameras had captured her wearing distinctive pink gardening gloves during both the planting and the reporting. The same gloves she wore to every HOA board meeting, probably thinking they made her look official instead of ridiculous. When the county environmental inspector arrived, I had to work hard to keep a straight face. The contamination turned out to be rotting fish that still smelled like Murphy's famous Friday fish fry, complete with seasoning and lemon wedges. "Ma'am," the inspector told Brenda, "this appears to be disposed restaurant food, not environmental contamination. Do you have any idea how it got here?" Brenda's face went through more color changes than a mood ring, settling on a sickly green that matched her guilty conscience. That evening, I got an unexpected visitor. Jimmy Kowalski's brother Danny, the private investigator Brenda had hired to dig up dirt on me, knocked on my door looking sheepish. "Mr. Holloway, I needed to come clean about something," Danny said, the porch light casting long shadows across his weathered face. "She owes me $1,200 and asked me to plant evidence in your garbage to make you look bad. I recorded the whole conversation." Danny handed me a small digital recorder. Brenda's voice came through crystal clear. "Find anything that makes him look dangerous, unstable, or illegal. If you can't find it, create it. I'll pay you a bonus if it sticks." The Kowalski brothers, both Jimmy the surveyor and Danny the PI, were now willing to testify about Brenda's systematic fraud and evidence tampering. Her web of corruption was unraveling faster than cheap fishing line. But she was getting desperate, and desperate people make dangerous mistakes. The financial pressure wasn't working, the harassment was creating evidence against her, and now her hired guns were switching sides. Brenda was about to discover what happens when you corner a veteran who's finally had enough. That weekend, while Brenda was probably plotting her next harassment campaign, I decided to explore my grandfather's legacy more thoroughly. In his old military trunk, the same olive drab footlocker he'd carried through Korea, I found documents that would change everything. Buried beneath his Bronze Star citation and faded photographs was the original 1960 property deed, still crisp despite 60 years in storage. As I unfolded the yellowed legal paper, the musty smell of old documents mixing with my grandfather's lingering Old Spice cologne, my hands started shaking. The deed didn't just establish property boundaries. It included something called riparian rights, granting permanent water access and mineral extraction privileges. But the real bombshell was in the surveyor's notes. My property extended 40 feet further west than anyone had realized, including a significant chunk of what everyone thought was common HOA land. Brenda's prized rose garden, the one she'd spent $15,000 of community improvement funds landscaping, was sitting squarely on my land. Her precious gazebo where she held court during neighborhood gatherings, also mine. The woman had been trespassing on my property for 3 years while trying to steal it from me. But that wasn't the most shocking discovery. Cross-referencing the deed with current county maps revealed that the entire HOA formation was built on fraudulent property boundaries. They'd never had legal authority over my land because they'd never actually owned the property they claimed to be managing. The insurance angle became clear when I researched why Brenda's license had been suspended. Court records showed she'd filed false hail damage claims on properties she didn't own, using fake before and after photos to collect insurance payouts. The same pattern I was seeing now, targeting properties with elderly or deceased owners who couldn't fight back. Her HOA presidency wasn't about community improvement, it was a sophisticated property fraud scheme. She'd identify vulnerable properties, manufacture violations, then force sales through liens and legal pressure. The proceeds would fund her gambling habits and failed business ventures while she posed as a concerned neighbor protecting property values. My grandfather's trunk contained one more treasure, letters he'd written but never sent, expressing suspicion about the HOA formation process. His shaky handwriting revealed he'd suspected something fishy about the consent forms but died before he could investigate further. "Rex," one letter began, "if you're reading this, then the vultures have probably circled. Don't let them steal what we built. Fight for this land like I fought for this country." His military training had taught him to spot deception, and he'd smelled Brenda's fraud from the beginning. Now I had the legal ammunition to finish what he'd started. The riparian rights were ironclad, protected by decades of property law precedent that no HOA bylaw could override. Water access rights from 1960 trumped any residential association formed in the 1980s. Brenda's entire power structure was built on legal quicksand. But I didn't immediately reveal my discovery. Military logistics had taught me that timing is everything in strategy. Instead, I quietly contacted the state attorney general's office about the broader fraud pattern affecting multiple properties. If Brenda had done this to my family, how many other elderly property owners had she victimized? How many veterans had been intimidated into paying fraudulent fines or selling their family land? My case wasn't just about one cabin anymore. It was about systematic elder abuse and HOA corruption that needed state-level investigation. The Attorney General's office confirmed they'd received similar complaints about fraudulent HOA formations across Michigan. They were building a case for new legislation to protect property owners from predatory associations, and my documentation was exactly what they needed for their legislative testimony. The meeting was scheduled for the following month at my cabin, neutral ground away from the state capitol, where we could review evidence without political distractions. I spent the next week preparing a comprehensive presentation, financial fraud evidence, property boundary documents, victim testimonies, and recordings of Brenda's harassment campaigns. But I kept the biggest revelation secret. Brenda's rose garden empire was about to crumble when she discovered she'd been the trespasser all along. The next morning, I called an emergency meeting of what we'd started calling the Coffee Club, neighbors who'd been quietly gathering at my cabin to share Brenda horror stories. By 10 a.m., 12 people crowded around my grandfather's handmade dining table. the smell of fresh coffee mixing with righteous anger and nervous energy. Attorney Stella Crawford joined us via video call from her Grand Rapids office, her silver hair perfectly styled even on a Saturday morning. Folks, what we're looking at here goes way beyond property disputes. This is RICO territory, Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, originally designed for organized crime, but it applies perfectly to systematic HOA fraud. Martha Kessler, the elderly widow whose memorial garden had been destroyed, leaned forward with interest. You mean what she did to my Harold's roses was actual racketeering? Absolutely, Stella replied. Pattern of fraud, elder abuse through forging deceased signatures, and financial crimes affecting multiple victims. The federal government takes this very seriously. I spread my grandfather's property deed across the table like a battle map. Here's what changes everything. Grandpa's land extends 40 feet past where anyone thought. Brenda's entire rose garden kingdom sits on my property. Tom Bradley, the veteran whose flagpole had been under attack, whistled low. So she's been trespassing while trying to steal your land? For 3 years, I confirmed. But here's the strategy. We don't reveal this until the state attorney general meeting. Let her keep digging her legal grave. Sal Torino from Murphy's Diner had been quietly documenting Brenda's defamatory statements during her lunch hour gossip sessions. I've got witnesses to her calling you dangerous and unstable. That's textbook defamation with multiple witnesses. The knowledge sharing became a masterclass in fighting bureaucratic corruption. Stella explained that elder abuse statutes make forging a dead person's signature a federal crime, not just fraud. Systematic targeting of elderly homeowners triggers additional whistleblower protections that can result in significant financial rewards for victims who come forward. Most importantly, Michigan's private attorney general laws allow citizens to sue on behalf of the public when they uncover fraud affecting entire communities. My case could potentially recover stolen money for everyone Brenda had victimized over the years. Jimmy Kowalski contributed surveying expertise, explaining how to document actual property boundaries using county records instead of trusting HOA maps. His brother Danny provided private investigation techniques for legally gathering evidence of harassment and financial crimes. The key is documentation, Danny explained, accepting a second cup of Martha's famous coffee. Every photo, every recording, every witness statement builds the case. Patterns of abuse are much harder to dismiss than isolated incidents. We organized our evidence like a military operation. Tom Bradley contributed his service organization's legal defense fund and connections to other veterans who'd been targeted by predatory HOAs. Martha documented the systematic destruction of longtime residents' improvements through manufactured violations. The young couple with twins provided financial records showing how Brenda's arbitrary fines had forced them to choose between paying fake HOA penalties and buying groceries. Their story would resonate with any jury or legislative committee. Local newspaper editor Frank Morrison, recently retired from the Detroit Free Press, offered to document our fight for potential statewide coverage. HOA corruption is a growing problem across Michigan. Your case could be the catalyst for real legislative reform. Even hardware store owner Pete Kowalski, no relation to the Surveyor brothers, just another Polish name in our heavily ethnic neighborhood, started an unofficial Rex Defense Fund by placing a coffee can at his checkout counter. Within a week, neighbors had contributed over $400 in loose change and small bills. The planning got detailed and specific. We created Operation Clipboard, our code name for coordinating the Attorney General presentation. Tom Bradley insisted on military-style operational security, which mainly meant using secure messaging apps and referring to Brenda as Target Alpha in our text communications. Martha brought homemade cookies to every planning session, insisting that righteous anger worked better on a full stomach. Her chocolate chip cookies became the unofficial fuel of our resistance movement. The timeline was ambitious but achievable. 30 days to gather final evidence, coordinate witness testimonies, and prepare comprehensive documentation for the state attorney general. Stella would present the legal framework while I provided the human story and evidence of systematic abuse. Our secret weapon was patience. While Brenda escalated her harassment campaigns, we were building an ironclad federal case that would expose her entire fraud operation. Every threatening letter she sent, every bogus fine she imposed, every lie she spread just added more evidence to our growing pile. The coffee club had evolved from a support group into a well-organized resistance movement. We had legal expertise, documentation, witnesses, financial backing, and most importantly, the moral clarity that comes from fighting genuine injustice. Brenda thought she was pressuring isolated victims into submission. She was actually uniting an entire community against systematic corruption. The trap was set. Now we just had to wait for her to walk into it. Brenda's desperation hit like a tornado the following week. She hired Danny Kowalski, before he switched sides, to follow me around town like some discount private eye from a bad movie. The irony was delicious. She was paying someone to gather dirt on me while I was building a federal case against her. But her real masterpiece was the false police report. Officer Mike Torres knocked on my door Tuesday evening, his cruiser's red and blue lights painting my cabin walls like a crime scene. The smell of pine needles and evening mist couldn't mask the tension crackling in the air. "Mr. Holloway, we received a complaint that you threatened someone with violence, specifically mentioning your military training," Torres said, looking about as convinced as a skeptical teenager. "Care to tell me your side?" I invited him in for coffee and laid out my complete documentation: security camera footage, recorded conversations, witness statements, the works. Torres spent 2 hours reviewing everything, his expression growing more disgusted with each piece of evidence. "Between you and me," he said finally, "Mrs. Wickshire has credibility issues with our department. Her story has more holes than Swiss cheese, and the timeline doesn't match her previous complaints." Torres left me with unofficial advice. "Keep documenting everything. This woman's harassment pattern is escalating, and desperate people make dangerous mistakes." The next morning brought Brenda's most brazen move yet. She arrived at the county building with a briefcase full of fake environmental reports, trying to bribe Inspector Carl Hendricks into condemning my septic system. The woman actually offered him $500 to write up emergency violations that would force me off my property. Carl called me immediately. "Rex, you're not going to believe what just happened. That HOA lady tried to pay me to fabricate violations on your property. I've got the whole conversation recorded on my phone." But Brenda's psychological warfare extended beyond my property lines. She called my ex-wife with elaborate lies about my criminal behavior and mental instability, claiming I was becoming dangerous and shouldn't have visitation rights with our daughter. "Dad, Mom's worried about you," my daughter said during our weekly call, her voice small and confused. "She says people are saying you threatened to hurt someone." That conversation nearly broke my heart. Explaining to your child that someone is spreading lies about you feels like trying to describe cancer. Ugly, unfair, and impossible to make sense of. Meanwhile, Brenda's whisper campaign reached nuclear levels. At the post office, grocery store, even the gas station, she'd corner anyone who'd listen with stories about the dangerous veteran who shouldn't be allowed around decent families. Young mothers started crossing the street when they saw me coming. The pharmacist asked if I was getting proper mental health treatment. Even my barber, who'd cut my hair for 5 years, seemed nervous and wouldn't make eye contact. The psychological pressure was brutal, but every escalation was creating more evidence. My security cameras caught her teenager accomplice dumping motor oil near my dock at midnight, the same kid she'd paid $50 to create fake environmental violations. When the county inspector arrived to investigate her anonymous complaint, I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. The contamination was obviously planted, complete with receipts from the auto parts store still stuck to the oil containers. But the real breakthrough came when Danny Kowalski knocked on my door, looking like a man carrying a guilty conscience. The porch light cast long shadows across his weathered face as he shifted nervously from foot to foot. "Mr. Holloway, I can't do this anymore. She owes me $1,200 and asked me to plant evidence in your garbage to make you look dangerous. I recorded everything because I knew she'd try to stiff me on payment." Danny handed me a digital recorder containing Brenda's voice giving explicit instructions. "Find anything that makes him look unstable, violent, or illegal. If you can't find evidence, create it. I'll pay a $1,000 bonus if it leads to his arrest." The woman had crossed from harassment into conspiracy and evidence tampering, both serious felonies that would play beautifully in federal court. Her financial desperation was becoming obvious too. The HOA bank account was down to $847 after 2 years of systematic theft. Reserve funds that should have covered snow removal and landscaping had disappeared into her personal LLC, funding her son's failed restaurant and covering gambling debts at the Indian casino. Several homeowners received overdue notices for services they'd already paid for through HOA fees. The community was starting to notice that their association wasn't providing the services they'd been paying for. Brenda needed my property sale to cover the missing money before the annual audit exposed her theft. She was trapped between federal prosecution and financial ruin, which made her more dangerous but also more desperate. The coffee club watched her meltdown with mixture of satisfaction and concern. Cornered animals bite, and Brenda was running out of legal options. Brenda's final gambit arrived via Channel 7 news van pulling into my driveway on a Thursday morning. The crunch of gravel under television truck tires mixed with the distant sound of loons calling across the lake, nature's soundtrack to media manipulation. Reporter Jessica Chen knocked on my door with cameras rolling, her perfectly styled hair catching the morning sunlight. "Mr. Holloway, we're investigating reports that you've been threatening elderly neighbors and using your military background to intimidate residents. Would you care to comment?" I invited them in for coffee, which seemed to surprise Jessica. Most people either slam doors in reporters' faces or launch into defensive rants. Instead, I calmly set out my complete documentation on the dining room table. Photos, recordings, legal documents, and witness statements organized like evidence at a crime scene. "This should be interesting," I said, pouring fresh coffee into my grandfather's old mugs. "Let me show you what's really been happening in our little community." Jessica's cameraman kept rolling as I walked them through Brenda's systematic fraud campaign. The forged signatures, the missing HOA funds, the harassment videos, even the security footage of her planting dead fish near my septic system. By the time I finished, Jessica was furiously taking notes while her cameraman muttered, "Holy shit," under his breath. "This isn't the story we came to cover," Jessica admitted. "Someone called our tip line claiming you were a dangerous veteran terrorizing innocent neighbors." That someone was obviously Brenda, who'd spent her morning crafting a narrative about the unstable military man threatening peaceful retirees. She'd even provided carefully edited photos making my cabin improvements look like compound fortifications, and my security cameras appear sinister rather than protective. But Brenda's media strategy backfired spectacularly when the story aired that evening. Instead of painting me as the villain, Channel 7 ran a segment titled HOA Horror When Neighbors Attack, featuring my evidence and multiple neighbor testimonies. Martha Kessler appeared on camera holding photos of her husband's memorial garden before Brenda destroyed it. 40 years of marriage, and she called his roses unauthorized landscaping. That woman has no soul. Tom Bradley stood beside his perfectly legal flagpole. "I fought for this country, and now I'm fighting for the right to honor it on my own property." The young couple with twins described choosing between fake HOA fines and buying groceries. "She fined us $300 because our children drew hopscotch squares with sidewalk chalk." Within hours, Channel 7's phone lines were flooded with similar HOA horror stories from across Michigan. The station assigned a full investigative team to what they dubbed the HOA Files, a week-long series about predatory residential associations. Local social media exploded with support. Murphy's Diner became unofficial headquarters for the Free Rex movement, with Sal Torino posting daily updates on Facebook. The hardware store's coffee can collection grew to over $800 in community donations. But the real victory came when Channel 7's legal correspondent contacted Attorney General Rebecca Santos for comment. The AG's office confirmed they were investigating systematic HOA fraud across Michigan and planned to use my case as a flagship example in upcoming legislative testimony. "Mr. Holloway's documentation represents exactly the kind of predatory behavior we're working to stop," Santos said on camera. "No homeowner should face harassment, fraud, or intimidation from their residential association." The media attention triggered something beautiful. Other Brenda victims started coming forward. A retired teacher from across town called to report that Brenda had targeted her late husband's property with fraudulent violations. A veteran from the next county shared recordings of Brenda offering to consult on his HOA problems for a hefty fee. Even the Kowalski brothers went public. Jimmy appeared on camera explaining how Brenda had paid him to find violations regardless of actual measurements. Danny provided audio recordings of her instructions to plant evidence and create false documentation. The state attorney general's office moved our meeting up by 2 weeks, citing urgent public interest in the case. They also assigned additional staff to investigate the broader pattern of HOA corruption we'd uncovered. Brenda tried damage control, calling Channel 7 to demand equal time for her side of the story. But when Jessica Chen arrived at her house with cameras rolling, Brenda refused to answer questions about the missing HOA funds, the forged signatures, or the evidence tampering. Instead, she hid behind her front door shouting about fake news and veteran privilege, phrases that sounded increasingly desperate through the wood paneling. The community transformation was remarkable. Neighbors who'd been afraid to speak up were now organizing, sharing stories, and demanding accountability. The coffee club expanded to over 20 families, all documenting their experiences with Brenda's systematic abuse. We'd gone from isolated victims to a movement for change. The Attorney General meeting was scheduled for the following week, and Brenda was about to discover what happens when fraud meets federal prosecution. Tuesday afternoon arrived crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight dancing across the lake like scattered gold coins. State Attorney General Rebecca Santos stepped out of her black SUV at exactly 2 p.m., followed by her aide and a plainclothes security officer. Professional, composed, and carrying a briefcase that probably contained the future of HOA reform in Michigan. I was greeting her at my front door, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries about the beautiful lakefront setting, when the unmistakable screech of tires on gravel announced Brenda's arrival. Her white Toyota Highlander skidded into my driveway like she was responding to a 5-alarm fire, kicking up a cloud of dust and dead leaves. "Perfect timing," I muttered, as Brenda exploded from her vehicle, clutching her sacred clipboard and dragging Dale Pritchard behind her like reluctant backup. She stormed across my yard, orthopedic shoes pounding the earth with righteous fury, completely oblivious to the state official standing in my doorway. The woman was so focused on her latest harassment mission that she missed the government license plates and professional attire that should have been obvious warning signs. "Rex Holloway," she bellowed, waving her measuring tape like a weapon. "You're in violation of 17 new residential codes, and I'm here for immediate compliance inspection. This illegal gathering violates occupancy restrictions." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear a loon calling from across the lake. Brenda stopped mid-stride, her mouth still open from her tirade, as she finally noticed the impeccably dressed woman standing beside me with a state security badge visible on her suit jacket. Attorney General Santos raised one perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Ma'am, you just committed breaking and entering, trespassing, and harassment in front of Michigan's chief law enforcement officer. I suggest you step back and identify yourself." Brenda's face went through more color changes than a mood ring, red with anger, white with shock, then a sickly green as recognition dawned. Her clipboard trembled in her hands like a leaf in a hurricane. I didn't know that this is official HOA business," she stammered, backing toward her vehicle while Pritchard tried to disappear behind a maple tree. "Are you Brenda Wickshire?" Santos asked, consulting notes from her briefcase. "The HOA president we've been investigating for systematic fraud, elder abuse, and racketeering?" The word racketeering hit Brenda like a physical blow. She actually staggered backward, clutching her chest like she might faint. "This is all lies. He's a dangerous veteran who threatened me. I have documentation." "Interesting," Santos replied coolly. "Because we have documentation too. Hours of security footage showing you planting evidence, recordings of you instructing private investigators to fabricate violations, and financial records proving you've embezzled over $60,000 from your neighbors." I stepped forward with my presentation folder, the autumn breeze rustling through documents that represented months of careful investigation. "Also, Brenda, there's something you should know about your prize-winning rose garden." Her eyes narrowed with suspicion and growing panic. "What about my garden? It's on my land, has been for 3 years. I unfolded my grandfather's original property deed, pointing to the surveyor's marks that clearly showed her landscaping empire sitting squarely on my property. You've been trespassing while trying to steal my cabin. The irony is just delicious." Brenda snatched the deed from my hands, her eyes scanning the legal description with growing horror. The measuring tape fell from her other hand, hitting the ground with a metallic clang that sounded like a gavel dropping. "This can't be right," she whispered, but her voice carried the hollow ring of someone whose world was collapsing in real time. Santos's aide stepped forward with official documentation. "Ms. Wickshire, you're looking at federal charges for elder fraud, systematic racketeering, evidence tampering, and civil rights violations. The FBI will be contacting you shortly about your criminal activities." Pritchard finally found his voice. "I was just following her orders. I didn't know about the missing money or the forged documents. She told us the formation was legal." "Dale, shut up," Brenda snapped, but it was too late. He'd just admitted knowledge of fraudulent HOA formation in front of the state's top prosecutor. Santos's security officer politely but firmly escorted both of them off my property while I continued my presentation. Through the window, I watched Brenda's final meltdown, screaming about fake news and veteran conspiracies while being walked to her vehicle. As her Highlander disappeared down the road, Santos turned to me with something resembling a smile. "Mr. Holloway, your documentation is exactly what we need for the legislative hearings next month. This case will be the cornerstone of our HOA reform initiative. Channel 7's news van arrived just as state vehicles were departing, capturing footage of Brenda's humiliating retreat and my dignified statement about justice finally being served. The war was over. Brenda had walked into the biggest mistake of her life, and it was all captured on camera. 1 week later, FBI agents arrested Brenda and Pritchard at 6 a.m. on federal fraud charges. The local newspaper ran a front-page photo of Brenda in handcuffs, her sacred clipboard abandoned on her driveway like a fallen weapon. The headline read, "Veteran exposes multi-million-dollar HOA fraud ring." The legal dominoes fell fast and hard. A federal judge dissolved the HOA by court order, returning property management to individual homeowners. The State Victim Compensation Fund covered my legal fees, and Brenda was ordered to pay $89,000 in restitution to all her victims. Pritchard's tire shop was sold to cover back taxes and legal settlements. Turns out owing $18 grand to the IRS while participating in fraud isn't a winning business strategy. Jimmy and Danny Kowalski received whistleblower rewards totaling $15,000 from the state attorney general's office. They used the money to start their own honest surveying and investigation business, serving homeowners who needed protection from predatory HOAs. The community transformation was beautiful to witness. Martha Kessler's memorial garden was restored with volunteer labor from 20 neighbors, including roses donated by the local garden center. Tom Bradley's flagpole controversy became a neighborhood celebration of veterans, with families contributing flags from their own military service. Our coffee club evolved into the Lakeshore Community Association, completely voluntary, no mandatory fees, focused on organizing block parties and maintaining our private road. We meet monthly at my cabin, and Martha still brings her famous chocolate chip cookies to fuel our discussions about community projects instead of legal battles. The personal healing felt just as important as the legal victory. My relationship with my ex-wife improved dramatically when she realized I'd been fighting systematic fraud, not picking petty fights with neighbors. "I never doubted your integrity," she admitted, "but I was worried about the stress affecting you." My daughter visited the cabin for the first time in 2 years, proud of her father's courage in standing up to corruption. We spent the weekend fishing from Grandpa's dock, and she caught a 3-pound bass that would have made him beam with pride. The Veterans Organization honored me for defending community values against systematic corruption, but the real honor was restoring peace to a neighborhood that had been terrorized by one woman's greed and power hunger. Using the fraud settlement money, I established the Lakefront Veterans Retreat, offering free weekend stays for combat veterans needing peaceful recovery time. Martha manages the bookings from her kitchen table, and Tom Bradley leads fishing expeditions that have become legendary among visiting vets. We've hosted over 40 veterans in our first year, providing the same healing my grandfather's cabin gave me. The program partners with state mental health services for PTSD support, turning Brenda's attempted theft into something that honors military service. There's poetry in that justice. Her greed created something beautiful for the people she tried to harm. My YouTube channel, Know Your Property Rights, has over 50,000 subscribers, featuring Attorney General Santos in regular updates about HOA reform legislation. We've helped expose 12 additional HOA fraud cases across Michigan, creating a network of protected homeowners who refuse to be bullied by petty tyrants. The best part? Where Brenda's rose garden used to bloom, we installed the community compost bin. Neighbors contribute yard waste that becomes fertilizer for Martha's memorial garden. Even in defeat, Brenda's legacy feeds something beautiful. Every evening I sit on my grandfather's dock watching sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and crimson, coffee steaming in the cool air, listening to loons call across water that belongs to my family forever. The stress weight I'd carried for months melted away like morning mist, replaced by the deep satisfaction of justice served and community restored. Brenda got 5 years in federal prison and will spend the rest of her life paying restitution to the neighbors she tried to rob. Pritchard received probation and community service, mostly picking up trash along the same roads where he'd once enforced Brenda's tyrannical rules. Standing up to bullies doesn't just protect you, it protects everyone who comes after you. Have you survived an HOA nightmare? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might help another viewer fight back against systematic fraud and harassment. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell because we're building a community of people who refuse to be intimidated by petty tyrants with clipboards. Next week, how a small-town mayor tried to shut down a veteran's food truck until he discovered the vet had direct access to the governor's office.